Blade was an interesting franchise, to say the least. It went from a 90s grunge fest to a body horror to a TASM 2-esque sequel spin-off trailer movie. And that was just with 3 movies, believe it or not. And it might be a bit hard to believe, but at the time of writing, it's actually been 17 years since we've had a Blade movie. 17 years. But if reports are to be believed, we were supposed to have a lot more Blade movies. So what if we did? What if Blade Trinity did better at the box office and the Blade sequel plans actually came to fruition? Simply put, what if there were more Blade movies? So let's say somehow Blade Trinity is not the last Blade movie in the franchise, and it does continue on for at least a 4th movie. So what was the franchise going to have been like from that point on? Well, first of all, we should discuss, of course, the extremely volatile onset issues of Blade Trinity. Now, Wesley Snipes has, of course, denied everything that I'm about to say, and I'm not going to say that he couldn't be right, because, yeah, I mean, basically he says that his onset issues were because they were setting up a spin-off, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and he felt they were taking the franchise away from him. And while I'm not saying that that couldn't be true, but considering that absolutely nobody from that movie tried to side with him or agree with him, that might suggest that he just might have been lying. I'm just saying. Either way, that's neither here or there. Basically, what happened, supposedly, is that, Blade Trinity was directed by David S. Goyer, the man who had done the writing of the first 2 Blade movies. And Wesley Snipes and Goyer didn't really get along very well. And Goyer's promotion to director pissed Wesley Snipes off to the point that he basically decided to sandbag Trinity's production. He spent a lot of time in his trailer smoking pot, refused to film scenes with the actors actually in the room with him, and they had to use a lot of body doubles. He would only ever answer to the name Blade. He would only communicate via post-it notes, and he even infamously refused to even open his eyes during a scene, and they had to CGI over his actual eyes. Oof. Now, again, these are all rumors. Wesley Snipes denies all of that, but again, it does seem a bit accurate since so many people have confirmed that this happened. So with Blade Trinity not exactly being a critical or commercial darling, combined with all these onset issues, the Blade franchise ended up being nipped in the bud right then and there. But supposedly, the plan was to follow up Trinity with a lot more projects, and supposedly, actually, a good chunk of them wouldn't have even had Wesley Snipes in them. Most notably, the plan was to do a spin-off movie for the Night Stalkers, aka Ryan Reynolds' Hannibal King and Jessica Biel's Abigail Whistler. And you can actually tell that that's what they were planning to do, since they did give those 2 a very prominent role in Trinity, and even had them be the only members of the Night Stalkers to actually survive the movie. They also gave Reynolds a lot of screen time to try and get his character over with audiences. Now, there actually was a deleted ending to Blade Trinity that would have shown Hannibal and Abigail going off on their own solo adventure to fight off werewolves, which would have been introduced to this universe in this movie. And of course, they would have been the main antagonist of the Night Stalkers movie. And actually, this goes hand in hand with some other rumors that have officially been confirmed. Basically, in the early 2000s, if anybody ever got the Blade movies mixed up with the Underworld movies, then fear not, because that was actually somewhat intentional. You see, Kate Beckinsale, who played the lead role Selene in the Underworld movies, has since actually confirmed that there were talks going on to possibly cross the 2 over, with Blade 4 and Underworld Evolution set to actually be merged together into one huge crossover movie. And that actually does make a lot of sense to me, considering that, as I said, werewolves are going to be introduced in Night Stalkers, and they could have easily been referred to as Lycans by other people. Especially since that ending was cut and they didn't actually refer to them as werewolves in this new version, so they could easily just say that they were called Lycans all the time. It would have been an easy transition. Now, there were reportedly also rumors that if this crossover did happen, then they were actually going to be doing it without Wesley Snipes, and were instead going to be using their own version of the Blade character. But ultimately, this crossover ended up falling through when Blade was bought out by Marvel Studios, who understandably wanted to do their own thing with the Blade character, together and decided to ultimately scrap all of the Blade Underworld crossover plans. So now another interesting thing to note actually is that New Line Cinema was also reportedly interested in doing a Blade prequel focusing on the main villain from the first movie, Deacon Frost. Now this idea might have been inspired by Underworld Rise of the Lycans, which was actually a prequel focusing on the first movie's main villain, Michael Sheen's Lucian. Now Stephen Dorff, who played Frost, was actually really excited to play the role again, since he really enjoyed working with Stephen Norrington and really thought he had some good ideas. But in the end, however, these plans ultimately came at a really poor time because they were coming up with these ideas back in 2008, right when the Marvel Cinematic Universe started with Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk. Marvel had bought the rights back to Blade in the early 2010s, and they decided that they didn't like the dark direction that they were thinking of taking the Blade franchise. So they ultimately scrapped all of those plans. Now, as of writing, Wesley Snipes is officially no longer going to be playing Blade, as it has been confirmed that he's being recast with Mahershala Ali for the new Blade reboot. And that is what would have happened if the Blade movies had continued. So now, I think it's pretty interesting to see just how kind of unfocused the direction of the franchise was. There were so many ideas being thrown around, and I also think that this goes to show just how possibly overconfident New Line Cinema was in Blade as a brand. And maybe Disney wound up making the same mistake, but I don't think so. I ultimately do think that Disney's, Blade reboot is going to be possibly more successful than any of the Wesley Snipes movies, just because MCU movies are just so damn profitable. And, the Blade movies were harder to market back then because people didn't really know how to treat them. They were just so different from any superhero movie coming out at the time, really. But of course, nowadays we live in a time where rated R superhero movies are the norm, where you can get movies like Joker or the Deadpool movies, which are rated R superhero movies, and they make a huge profit, the highest grossing rated R movies ever made. But back then, it was a lot harder to market a rated R superhero movie, I feel. And then, of course, there's the fact that, even if Trinity was a bigger hit, I don't think people would be that interested in seeing say a Night Stalker spin-off movie. Even though Ryan Reynolds gave a lot of charisma to the character of Hannibal King, and he kind of did sort of, deliver a proto-Deadpool type performance, I don't think that he would have been enough to deliver a Night Stalkers movie that would be financially profitable. Even though he was so, charismatic, and Jessica Biel was also, not that bad, I think that ultimately a Night Stalkers movie would get lost in the fold, especially if the Underworld crossover never happened, because Underworld was already doing the whole vampires, werewolf thing, and I think Night Stalkers would just kind of get lost in the fold. And then, of course, they would do it again later in the same decade with Twilight. So ultimately, I do think a Night Stalker spinoff sounds promising. I'm not even saying it would be bad. I actually think it had a lot of potential to be great. But ultimately, I do think it would probably not be very financially profitable. Blade 4, I also don't think would be profitable unless it was an Underworld crossover. And even if it was, I don't know if it would be as profitable without Wesley Snipes, because if they were going to do a Blade movie in the 2000s, I think they would have to have Wesley Snipes, just being honest. Even if Wesley Snipes apparently was kind of a pain in the ass to work with, supposedly anyway. Ultimately, I think these plans are interesting. I am a huge fan of the Underworld movies. I own all 5 Underworld movies, and I'm very curious to see how the franchise goes from here, whether it's a Underworld 6 or Underworld TV show like they've been talking about. I'm very interested. And I think a crossover with Blade, personally, would have been really cool. Ultimately, though, I am kind of glad they didn't do it, because I like the direction they went with the Underworld movies, and no offense to Blade, he might have gotten in the way a little bit. But overall, I do think it's a cool curiosity, and maybe in a different timeline, people watch the Underworld Blade crossover, and it started a new cinematic universe that are still pumping out movies to this day. Who knows, really? But overall, I do think Blade as a franchise was never destined to happen. I just think Blade was too obscure at the time. Like, yeah, I mean, Blade 1 and 2 got a healthy profit, and Trinity didn't do that bad at the box office. Like, people kind of blow it out of proportions. It made a decent amount, but not enough, like, you know, so many prequels and spin-offs and sequels. You know, I don't know. I really do feel like the Blade franchise was never destined to be more than a trilogy. I feel like, you know, it was just too scattered by that point. The people working on it, you know, their ideas just, you know, they were never really set in stone, and I think that probably would have doomed it. And it did doom it, because, you know, Blade Trinity changed a lot in its production, which is another reason apparently why Wesley Snipes was sandbagging that movie, because plans changed and he didn't like the changes. So I don't know. I mean, it just sounds like the Blade franchise was just a bit too scattered to really work this much in the long term with this many more movies. So ultimately, as much as I wish Trinity had been a better movie, I do think it's ultimately a lot tidier with just the 3 films. But as I said, they would have been interesting curiosities in a different timeline. But anyway, guys, let me know what you think of all this in the comments down below. Would you have liked to see Wesley Snipes play Blade a 4th time, or would you have rather seen him being recast in the Underworld crossover? Would you have liked to see a Night Stalker spinoff or a Deacon Frost prequel? Let me know your opinions on all that in the comments down below. Also, please give me more what if recommendations, as well as give this video a thumbs up and share with all of your friends and all your various social media platforms. And I'll see everybody in the next video.